The Proxima Galactic Station buzzed with the usual chatter of tourists and the soft hum of atmospheric regulators. In the East Wing Endangered Sentience exhibit, Specimen 734 sat quietly in her enclosure. The information plaque outside the thick polyglass wall described her as Nixarian female, approximately 27 standard years, rescued during the final preservation mission to Nixara Prime. What it didn't mention was her name, Lanira, or the fact that she understood every word the visitors spoke as they pressed their faces against the barrier. "Look at her skin. It's almost translucent," a woman cooed, her child's sticky fingers smudging the polyglass. "She's like a beautiful doll." Lanira didn't react. She had learned long ago that any response only encouraged more tapping, more commentary, more dehumanizing stares. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the crowd, past the observation deck, where a maintenance door occasionally opened to admit the station engineers. One of those engineers was Jim Praxton, 32 years old, with perpetually disheveled brown hair and eyes that had seen too many late shifts. Jim's job was to maintain the life support systems for the East Wing exhibits. Every day, he checked the atmospheric mix for each enclosure, calibrated temperature controls, and monitored the simulated day-night cycles. It was routine work, but it paid well enough to cover his modest apartment in the residential ring and the occasional drink at Stellar Drift, the station's most popular bar. Jim had been working at the menagerie, as staff informally called it, for 3 years, long enough to become desensitized to the various specimens on display, or so he thought. That afternoon, as the crowd of visitors thinned with the approaching closing hour, Jim entered the observation corridor behind Lanira's enclosure. This area was hidden from public view by a one-way mirror. Visitors saw only a convincingly fabricated habitat, while staff could monitor the specimens without disturbing them. Jim knelt to check a faulty atmospheric regulator, his mind more focused on the upcoming weekend than the task at hand. When he glanced up, he found himself staring directly into Lanira's eyes. She was sitting with her back to the public viewing area, facing the staff corridor instead. Her gaze was fixed exactly where Jim knelt, though he knew she couldn't possibly see him through the one-way glass. Yet somehow, her eyes seemed to find his with unerring precision. They were unlike any eyes Jim had ever seen, large, with vertical pupils like a cat's, but a deep indigo color that seemed to shift and shimmer in the enclosure's artificial light. What struck him most wasn't their alien appearance, but the emotion they conveyed. In those eyes, Jim saw a profound sadness, a loneliness so intense it made his chest tighten. They reminded him of a lost kitten he'd once found as a child, abandoned and frightened in the rain. Jim froze, his hand hovering over the regulator. He'd serviced Lanira's enclosure dozens of times, but had never truly looked at her. The specimens were just part of the job, living components of the systems he maintained, no different from the air filters and temperature sensors. But now, something shifted in his perception. As he watched, Lanira slowly raised her hand and placed her palm against the glass. Her long, slender fingers splayed against the surface, and Jim noticed delicate patterns etched into her skin, swirling lines that might have been tattoos or natural markings. With her other hand, she began to trace symbols in the condensation that had formed on her side of the glass. The symbols were unlike anything Jim had seen before, complex, flowing patterns that somehow seemed vaguely familiar, as if he might have glimpsed them in a half-forgotten dream. Before he could process what he was seeing, the station's end-of-day announcement blared through the speakers, startling him. By the time he looked back, Lanira had withdrawn her hands and turned away, once again assuming the passive pose visitors expected to see. That night, Jim couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those indigo orbs staring back at him, those lost kitten eyes filled with an inexplicable sense of recognition. And something else. Something he couldn't quite name. A sense of loss so profound it transcended species. The next morning, he sketched the symbols Lanira had drawn on a scrap of paper. They weren't like any alien script he'd encountered during his technical training. Yet they tugged at something in his memory, like a word perpetually on the tip of his tongue. After his shift, instead of heading to his apartment, Jim made his way to the station's information archives. As a maintenance engineer, he had basic access to historical databases for troubleshooting purposes. He uploaded his sketch and ran a pattern-matching algorithm against known communication systems. After several minutes of processing, the system displayed a result that made Jim's heart skip. Partial match, Proto-Elamite script, Earth, circa 3000 BCE. An ancient human writing system. How could an alien from a distant star system possibly know an obscure Earth script that predated modern civilization? The database provided additional information. Proto-Elamite was one of humanity's earliest writing systems, used briefly in what was now Iran, and had never been fully deciphered by archaeologists. Jim downloaded reference images and spent hours comparing them to his sketches. The similarities were unmistakable, too precise to be coincidental. Either Lanira had somehow studied ancient Earth languages, or there was a connection between Nyxarians and humans that predated recorded history. The implications were staggering, but Jim's practical side asserted itself. Before jumping to cosmic conclusions, he needed more information, directly from the source. Over the next 3 days, Jim modified a small audio transducer from spare parts in the maintenance workshop. The device could be attached to the maintenance port of Lanira's enclosure, allowing two-way communication without alerting security systems. It was risky. Unauthorized interaction with specimens was grounds for immediate termination, but those haunting eyes wouldn't let him rest. During his next night shift, when the exhibit was closed and security was minimal, Jim made his move. He accessed the maintenance corridor behind Lanira's enclosure and installed the transducer in an inconspicuous spot near an air recycling vent. Then he waited, heart pounding, as the device initialized. "Can you understand me?" he whispered into the small microphone. Silence stretched for so long that Jim began to doubt his sanity. Perhaps he'd imagined the intelligence in those eyes, projected human qualities onto an alien creature who simply happened to draw random patterns that resembled an ancient script. Then a soft voice came through the speaker, slightly distorted, but unmistakably female, with an accent he couldn't place. "Yes, I understand." Jim nearly dropped the device. Despite his suspicions, hearing her voice, hearing proof of her sentience and linguistic abilities, sent a shock through his system. "My name is Jim," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Jim Praxton. I'm a maintenance engineer." Another pause, shorter this time. "I am Lanira, not Specimen 734. The simple assertion of her identity, her rejection of the menagerie's designation, hit Jim like a physical blow. Of course she had a name. Of course she was a person, not a specimen. "Lanira," he repeated, tasting the name. "I saw you drawing on the glass. Those symbols, they look like an ancient human writing system." "The old words," she replied. "From the exodus of the ancestors, before the cedar." Jim had no idea what she meant, but before he could ask, Lanira continued. "You have the eyes of knowing," she said. "Most humans look through me, not at me. You saw." "What happened to your people?" Jim asked, the question slipping out before he could consider its implications. Lanira's voice grew softer. "The official story is that Nyxarians were dying out naturally, that the menagerie saved us from extinction." A bitter note entered her voice. "The truth is different." A soft alarm beeped on Jim's wrist monitor. His scheduled rounds were overdue, and security would soon notice. "I have to go," he said reluctantly. "But I'll come back tomorrow night. I promise." "The Night Eyes are always watching," Lanira warned, and Jim understood she meant the security systems. "Be careful, Jim Praxton. Those who know truth become dangerous. The next day moved at an excruciating pace. Jim performed his duties mechanically, hyper-aware of the cameras tracking his movements, paranoid that his midnight conversation had been discovered. When his colleague Morales mentioned an upcoming security system upgrade, Jim nearly dropped his calibration tool. Yeah, they're installing neural pattern scanners in all the high-value exhibits, Morales said casually, as they ate lunch in the staff cafeteria. Apparently, some activist group has been making noise about sentient rights or something. Management's worried about break-ins. Jim forced himself to swallow his food. Neural pattern scanners? That's pretty advanced tech for simple security. Morales shrugged. Rumor is they're not just looking for intruders. They want to monitor unusual brainwave activity in the specimens themselves. Make sure none of them are getting too smart, I guess. That night, Jim returned to Lanira's enclosure with renewed urgency. The neural scanners would detect unauthorized communication. He had perhaps days, maybe hours, before their channel would be discovered. The menagerie is upgrading security, he told her, after activating the transducer. We don't have much time. I know, Lanira replied. The director was here today, watching me. I pretended to be empty, as they expect. The director? You mean Director Threll? Yes, the Vaxian with the silver face markings. He stands very close to the glass and examines me. Her voice carried a tremor. He knows something is changing. Perhaps he senses you in my thoughts. Jim's mouth went dry. Director Threll was rarely seen in the exhibits. He typically remained in the administrative sector, leaving operations to department heads. If he was personally inspecting Lanira, something was definitely wrong. Lanira, I need to understand what's happening. You mentioned the Cedar and an exodus. What did you mean? A long pause followed, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The old words tell that long ago. Nyxarians and humans were one people, seeded across the stars by those we call Cedar. When the great darkness came, the Cedar scattered us to preserve what they could. They left markers, what you call ancient monuments, to help us find our way back to each other when the time was right. Jim's mind reeled. Was she suggesting that humans and Nyxarians shared common ancestors? That Earth's mysterious ancient structures were some kind of alien technology? The Vaxians, Lanira continued, were meant to be caretakers, preserving knowledge until reunification. But they forgot their purpose. They began to see themselves as masters, the other species as specimens to be collected and studied. They fear what would happen if humans and Nyxarians remembered the truth. And the symbols you drew, the Proto-Elamite script? Our skin remembers what our minds forget, she said cryptically. The patterns are written in our flesh, dormant until awakened. Your ancient humans and my ancestors used the same written language because they were the same people, before the separation. It sounded fantastical, the stuff of fringe conspiracy theories. Yet, Jim couldn't dismiss it. The matching scripts were evidence he couldn't ignore. And there was something else, something he couldn't rationalize. When Lanira spoke of their shared heritage, it resonated with something deep inside him, like the recognition of a truth he'd always known, but never articulated. If what you're saying is true, Jim said carefully, then keeping you here isn't preservation, it's imprisonment. Yes. The simple affirmation hung in the air between them. I need to learn more, Jim decided. I need access to the menagerie's classified archives. The next day, Jim began the most dangerous hack of his life. Using his maintenance credentials, he accessed the environmental control network, then navigated through a series of increasingly restricted systems until he reached the secure archives. He had to work in short bursts, using legitimate maintenance tasks as cover, constantly alert for security protocols that might detect his intrusion. What he found, confirmed his worst fears. Buried deep in classified files was a report titled Controlled Extinction Event, Nyxara Prime. The document detailed a deliberate program to eliminate Nyxarians after discovering their potential for ancestral memory activation and the threat this posed to cross-contamination of knowledge paradigms between species. The menagerie hadn't rescued the last Nyxarians. They had orchestrated their extinction, preserving only a few specimens for study under controlled conditions. And Lanira wasn't being kept safe. She was being kept silent. That night, as Jim shared his discoveries with Lanira, a plan began to form. The neural pattern scanners would be installed in 3 days. Before then, they needed to find a way to free Lanira and escape the station. "Where would we go?" Lanira asked, a hint of hope creeping into her voice for the first time. "Earth," Jim replied without hesitation. "If what you've said is true, the answers we need are there. The ancient sites, the ones supposedly left by the cedar, might hold the key to proving your story." "Yes," Lanira said, her voice suddenly animated. "The primary node, what you call the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains the activation chamber for the global network." For the next 2 days, they prepared meticulously. Jim modified a portable atmospheric regulator to create a diversion in the North Wing exhibits. He obtained security badges from an unsuspecting colleague and mapped the least monitored route from the East Wing to the maintenance shuttles. Meanwhile, Lanira shared everything she knew about Cedar technology and the Earth sites that might contain it. On the night of the escape, Jim triggered the atmospheric anomaly in the North Wing, sending security personnel rushing to investigate the potential life support failure. Using the distraction, he slipped into the control room for Lanira's enclosure and disabled the polylass locking mechanism. Then, he opened the hidden maintenance access port, a small hatch designed for emergency repairs, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Lanira emerged silently, her movements graceful, despite years of confinement. In person, without the distortion of the polylass barrier, she was both more alien and more human than Jim had expected. Her skin had an opalescent quality, shifting slightly with her breathing, and the pattern of symbols he'd glimpsed before covered her arms and neck in intricate whorls. But her eyes, those haunting indigo eyes, were exactly as he remembered, now fixed on him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. They made their way through the dim service corridor, Jim leading, Lanira following closely behind. They had nearly reached the maintenance bay when the alarm sounded. Lanira's absence had been discovered sooner than expected. Trapped in a narrow service tunnel with security closing in from both sides, Jim and Lanira pressed against the wall, their options rapidly dwindling. In the cramped space, they were forced close together, and Jim could feel the strange, subtle heat radiating from her skin. "There's no way out," he whispered, despair creeping into his voice. "I'm sorry. I've failed you." Lanira looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand to his face. "The resonance," she said. "It might work between us." Before Jim could ask what she meant, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly transformed into something more profound. As their lips met, Jim experienced a cascade of images flooding his mind. Vast starscapes, unfamiliar planets, strange cities with impossible architecture. He saw ships traversing the void between stars, carrying passengers in suspended animation. He glimpsed a lush green world that must have been Nyxara Prime before its devastation. And through it all, he felt a resonance, a profound connection not just to Lanira, but to something larger, a shared heritage that transcended the boundaries of species and time. The old words Lanira had mentioned weren't just a script. They were a key to unlocking ancestral memories buried deep in human DNA. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Jim noticed something extraordinary. The symbols on Lanira's skin were glowing with a soft blue light. And, impossibly, similar patterns had begun to appear on his own arms, shimmering faintly beneath his skin. "The awakening," Lanira whispered, her eyes wide. "I didn't believe it would happen so quickly." A shout from the end of the corridor snapped them back to their immediate danger. Security forces were approaching, their footsteps echoing metallically. "The wall," Lanira said suddenly, pointing to an unremarkable section of the corridor. "The resonance has activated the dormant symbols. We can use them." She pressed her hand against the wall, and the blue glow from her skin seemed to transfer to the metal surface, revealing hidden patterns that matched those on her arms. The wall vibrated subtly. Then a seam appeared where none had existed before, widening into an opening just large enough to pass through. They squeezed through the gap into a rarely used waste disposal channel. The acrid smell of industrial chemicals filled the air, but Jim barely noticed as he stared at his arms in disbelief. The glowing symbols were already fading, but the implications of what had just happened were staggering. The resonance was real. The shared heritage was real. And now they were fugitives. They made their way to the waste processing ejection system, a risky escape route. But their only option was security locking down all official exits. Jim had calculated that if they timed the ejection cycle correctly, they could be expelled with the waste material. Then use emergency thrusters from a maintenance pack to guide themselves to a nearby processing station. As they huddled in the cramped ejection chamber, waiting for the cycle to begin, Jim looked at Lanira, really looked at her. She was trembling slightly. Whether from fear or anticipation, he couldn't tell. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. "Once we leave, there's no coming back." Lanira met his gaze steadily. "I've been a prisoner my entire life, Jim Praxton. I would rather die free than live another day in that cage." The ejection sequence initiated with a mechanical whine. Jim gripped Lanira's hand as the chamber depressurized, and then they were shooting out into the void, surrounded by the detritus of the station. The cold of space bit through Jim's maintenance suit, but he focused on activating the emergency thrusters, guiding their trajectory toward the distant lights of the processing station. They landed hard on the outer hull, using magnetic grapples to secure themselves. Jim had to override the station's entry protocols, a relatively simple hack for a maintenance engineer, and soon they were inside, gasping in the recycled air of the loading bay. The processing station was a hub of activity, with automated systems and workers in environment suits moving about. Jim quickly fabricated basic maintenance coveralls for Lanira from supplies in a storage locker, and with some creative use of insulation foam, he managed to disguise the more obvious alien aspects of her appearance. The patterns on her skin had faded to subtle traceries that could pass for unusual tattoos in the dim light. Jim accessed an internal communication terminal, using his knowledge of the system to create false security alerts in various sectors of the main station. The resulting confusion would keep security forces disorganized long enough for them to secure transportation off the station. As they moved through the crowds of maintenance workers and cargo handlers, Jim spotted something that made his heart leap. Director Threll's personal shuttle docked at a private bay. The sleek vessel was lightly guarded, most of its security relying on sophisticated biometric locks rather than personnel. "Can you do that thing again?" Jim whispered, nodding toward the shuttle's entry hatch. "With the symbols and the wall?" Lanira studied the shuttle, her expression uncertain. "The resonance is unpredictable, but I can try." They approached the shuttle casually, as if they belonged there. When they reached the entry hatch, Lanira placed her palm against the biometric scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the faint patterns on her skin began to glow blue once more, and the scanner's display flickered from red to green. The hatch slid open with a soft hiss. Once inside, Jim quickly familiarized himself with the controls. The layout was different from the maintenance shuttles he was used to, but the basic principles were similar. More surprising was how intuitive certain aspects of the interface felt, as if the knowledge had always been there, dormant in his mind until now. They launched without incident, the shuttle's powerful engines carrying them away from the station before anyone realized what had happened. On the communication channel, they could hear Threll's furious voice demanding an explanation. But Jim shut it off. They had more important concerns now. The journey to Earth took 3 days at superluminal speeds. During that time, Jim and Lanira delved deeper into the awakened memories, exploring the ancestral knowledge that the resonance had triggered. Lanira taught Jim how to activate the ancient Cedar addresses, coordinates programmed into Earth's sacred sites that would allow them to access the hidden technology. According to the recovered memories, locations like Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and the Angkor temples were not merely impressive architectural achievements. They were nodes in a global network designed by the Cedar civilization to reconnect humans and Nixarians when the time was right. The Great Pyramid at Giza was the primary node, containing the activation chamber for the entire network. If they could reach it and initiate the sequence, the truth would be revealed not just to them, but to all of humanity. They landed the shuttle in a secluded valley near the Giza Plateau, using the craft's cloaking technology to avoid detection. The scorching Egyptian sun beat down on them as they made their way across the desert, tourists and archaeological teams visible in the distance around the ancient structures. Jim had expected to face significant security or restricted access, but they blended seamlessly with the crowds of visitors. No one gave them a second glance. Lanira's alien features were subtle enough to pass unnoticed, with the addition of a headscarf and sunglasses, and the authorities were looking for fugitives from a space station, not tourists at an archaeological site. As they approached the Great Pyramid, Lanira became increasingly agitated. "It's here," she whispered, her eyes darting across the ancient stones. "I can feel it calling to us." They circled the massive structure, Lanira leading the way, with an instinctive certainty. Near the eastern face, away from the main tourist paths, she stopped abruptly and knelt in the sand. "Here," she said, beginning to dig with her hands. "The entrance was hidden long ago, but the resonance reveals it." Jim joined her, scooping away the accumulated sand of millennia. After several minutes of digging, his fingers struck something solid, not stone, but metal. They cleared more sand, revealing a large panel covered in the same symbols that had appeared on their skin during the resonance. "The activation chamber," Lanira breathed, reverence in her voice. "Just as the memories showed." A shadow fell across them. Jim looked up to see Director Threll standing a few meters away, flanked by 2 security officers in unmarked suits. His silver facial markings caught the sunlight, giving him an eerie, otherworldly appearance. "I must admit, I'm impressed," Threll said, his voice as smooth and cold as the metal panel beneath their hands. "No specimen has ever managed to escape the menagerie, let alone make it this far." Jim stood slowly, positioning himself between Lanira and the Vaxian. "She's not a specimen. She never was." Threll's expression hardened. "You don't understand what you're meddling with. Engineer Praxton, the separation of species is necessary, mandated by the Cedar Compact itself. What you're attempting to activate was never meant to be used." "You're lying," Lanira said, rising to stand beside Jim. "The Vaxians were entrusted as guardians, not jailers. You were supposed to preserve our heritage until we were ready to reclaim it, not eradicate us and keep the knowledge for yourselves." Threll's hand moved to a weapon at his belt. The compact was clear. Humanity isn't ready for the truth. The contamination of knowledge would be catastrophic. "That's not your decision to make," Jim said firmly. "It never was." In that moment, Lanira let out a cry, not of fear, but of recognition. She shouted a phrase in a language Jim had never heard yet somehow understood. "Cedar Avath, Nimarakath." The ground beneath them trembled. Sand shifted and flowed away from the metal panel, as if repelled by an invisible force, revealing its full extent, a massive disk at least 3 meters across, covered entirely in the ancient script. In the center was a handprint indentation, sized for a human palm. "Stop them!" Threll shouted, but his security officers hesitated, unnerved by the impossible movement of the sand and the glowing metal that had begun to pulse with blue light. Jim and Lanira exchanged a glance, an entire conversation passing between them in an instant. Together, they placed their hands on the central indentation. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. A column of blue light erupted from the panel, shooting straight up into the sky with such intensity that it was visible even in the bright daylight. Around the world, at other ancient sites, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, the Angkor temples, the Easter Island Moai, similar beams of light appeared, connecting the nodes of the long-dormant network. And with the light came knowledge, not just for Jim and Lanira, but for every human on Earth. It washed over them in waves, ancestral memories awakening after millennia of dormancy. People around the globe simultaneously experienced visions of the stars, of distant worlds, of a time when humanity and Nyxarians were one people, guided by the enigmatic Cedar civilization. Threll fell to his knees, his weapon forgotten as the light enveloped him too. "The compact," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We misunderstood. We were supposed to protect, to nurture, not to separate and control." All around the Great Pyramid, tourists and workers stood transfixed, their faces upturned to the beam of light, experiencing the shared awakening. Some wept, others laughed in joyous disbelief as the truth of their cosmic heritage unfolded in their minds. In that moment of universal revelation, barriers of language, culture, and species became meaningless. The artificial division between human and Nyxarian dissolved in the face of their shared origin and destiny. The light faded gradually, but its effects remained. Jim helped Lanira to her feet. They had collapsed during the intensity of the activation. Around them, people were embracing, talking excitedly, their perceptions forever altered by what they had experienced. Threll approached them slowly, his earlier hostility replaced by a profound humility. "The Vaxians have much to atone for," he said quietly. "We betrayed our purpose, convinced ourselves we were protecting when we were only controlling." In the months that followed, Earth became the center of a new renaissance. The Cedar technology, dormant for thousands of years, was reactivated at sites around the world. The ancient monuments became educational and cultural exchange centers, where humans could learn about their cosmic heritage and the complex history that had been hidden from them. The revelation that humanity had extraterrestrial origins was met not with fear or denial, but with a sense of expanded possibility. The knowledge unlocked by the resonance included advanced technological concepts, sustainable energy systems, and healing techniques that rapidly transform society. Most significantly, the activation of the Cedar network revealed the locations of other Nyxarian survivors, small groups who had been hidden away on distant worlds, preserved by factions of Vaxians who had remained true to their original purpose. Lanira was not the last of her kind after all. 6 months after the Giza activation, Jim and Lanira stood on the observation deck of a new vessel, the first ship of the restored Nyxarian-Human Alliance. Below them, the blue-green sphere of Earth slowly rotated, the activated Cedar nodes visible as points of soft light against the planet's surface. "Where to first?" Jim asked, his hand finding Lanira's. The symbols on their skin had become permanent after the activation, matching patterns that twined around their arms like vines, a visible reminder of their shared heritage. Lanira's once haunted eyes now sparkled with purpose and hope. "Proxima Centauri," she said decisively. "There's a Nyxarian preservation facility there, one managed by Vaxians, who remain true to the compact. They need to know they're not alone anymore. Jim nodded, feeling the rightness of the decision resonating through him. The lost kitten eyes that had first captured his attention were gone, replaced by the confident gaze of a woman who had reclaimed her heritage and helped restore a cosmic balance. As the ship's engines hummed to life and the stars beckoned before them, Jim reflected on how far they had come from that first moment of connection through the polylass barrier. What had begun as an act of compassion toward a caged alien had evolved into something world-changing, the reunion of two branches of the same cosmic family tree, and the beginning of humanity's true awakening. "The cedar called us the first children," Lanira said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Now we return to our original space, not as specimens or engineers, but as what we were always meant to be, explorers and rememberers." The ship accelerated smoothly, leaving Earth behind. But unlike the separations of the past, this departure was not an ending, but a beginning, the first step in a journey of reconnection that spanned not just space, but time itself. The lost had been found, the forgotten remembered, and the future, at last, restored to its intended path.